July 1943, Sicily. The heat hung thick over the olive groves, the air trembling with the echo of retreating bombers. Dust and smoke rolled over the hills where the front had shifted once again. And in the middle of a scorched field, half buried in the soil, lay something no one expected to see this far behind Axis lines. The aircraft was unlike anything the Italians had ever seen. Two long silver booms stretched from a shattered cockpit, joined by a single tailplane. The nose was crushed into the earth, one propeller still slowly turning in the breeze. Steam hissed faintly from its pierced radiators, and the smell of burned fuel mixed with the scent of dry grass. A squad of Italian infantry arrived first, rifles slung over their shoulders, their boots crunching on the parched soil. They moved cautiously, circling the wreck. The plane's metal skin still shimmered under the sun, as if refusing to look defeated. "Americano," one of them whispered, pointing to the white star painted near the wing root. Another soldier kicked at the dirt and muttered, "How did it get here? There's no Allied base within 200 kilometers. The lieutenant crouched beside the fuselage, brushing away soot from the serial markings. "Lightning," he read aloud in broken English. "Lockheed. P-38. He looked back toward his men. "The Americans call it lightning." They peered inside the cockpit through cracked glass. The pilot's seat was empty, the harness cut clean. Whoever flew it had escaped, or been captured already. When the first truck from the Regia Aeronautica arrived, the soldiers stepped aside. Out stepped a young engineer in oil-stained coveralls, his cap tucked under one arm, eyes fixed on the wreck. Luigi Ferrero, metallurgist from Turin, had examined everything from British Spitfire fragments to German Messerschmitt parts. But nothing prepared him for this. He walked slowly around the aircraft, boots sinking into the soft earth. Every curve of the fuselage seemed wrong, too wide, too heavy, too symmetrical. Yet it also looked deliberate. He knelt beside one of the wings, pressing his palm against the metal. It was smooth, cool, and seamless, not hand-riveted like the planes he knew. "This shouldn't even be flying," muttered the corporal beside him. "It's too heavy, too strange." Ferrero didn't answer. He traced the line of the landing gear with his finger, a tricycle configuration unheard of for a frontline fighter. He looked at the engines, twin Allisons, one burned, one intact. 2 engines for a single seat. Redundant, unnecessary, and yet beautiful. He rose slowly, dust clinging to his knees. "Get this loaded carefully," he said. "I want it under cover by nightfall." The corporal frowned. "Sir, what's the point?" "It's wrecked." Ferrero turned to him, his expression distant. "It's not wrecked," he said quietly. "It's proof." The soldiers exchanged uncertain looks, but obeyed. They brought cables and planks, lifting the silver wreck onto a truck as the sun fell low behind the hills. As the convoy rolled toward the mainland, Ferrero stood in the back of the truck, one hand resting on the aircraft's torn skin. The smell of fuel lingered. The metal under his fingers felt alive, as if the plane itself had a pulse. He stared out toward the distant smoke columns and thought, if they can send this here, then maybe we've already lost. The engine sputtered, then faded into silence as the convoy disappeared down the dusty road. They thought they knew modern war, until they opened the P-38. The train carrying the wreck reached Capodichino Air Depot near Naples under heavy guard. The Americans were bombing the mainland now, and every crate of metal was considered vital to the war effort, even this one twisted and scorched. But the moment the tarp was lifted, the Italian engineers realized this wasn't salvage. It was revelation. The hangar lights flickered to life, humming above rows of workbenches and scattered blueprints. The air was thick with oil, fuel, and dust. In the center stood the Lightning, dented, bent, and yet impossibly intact. The twin booms stretched outward like a pair of silver spears, their surfaces gleaming even under grime. The tricycle landing gear still held firm, its nose wheel intact. Around it gathered a small circle of men, Regia Aeronautica engineers from Turin and Milan, mechanics from Fiat Aviazione, and one stiff-collared Luftwaffe liaison officer, Hauptmann Vogel, sent from Rome to oversee the analysis. He circled the wreck once, shaking his head. "Americani puzzy," he muttered, "crazy Americans." His tone was half contempt, half awe. The Italians said nothing. They didn't need to. Ferrero, standing closest to the aircraft, raised a hand to trace the outline of the twin engines. 2 Allisons, he said quietly. V-1710s. Each supercharged, perhaps turbo-supercharged. "Impossible," said Vogel, frowning. "A turbo system in a fighter this size? Nonsense." Ferrero smiled faintly. "Then it will be our pleasure to disprove nonsense." He climbed a small ladder and leaned into the damaged left engine nacelle. Inside, the piping network looked like the veins of some metallic creature. Snaking ducts, thick manifolds, and narrow control lines all converging toward the rear fuselage. Every tube was color-coded and marked with tiny stenciled numbers. "Look here," Ferrero said, pointing to a curved manifold. "These aren't just exhaust pipes. They feed pressure backward, not out. They're channeling hot gases through this conduit." He followed the line with his finger until it disappeared beneath the boom. "The turbo must be mounted aft inside the tail." The room fell quiet. Belodi, the metallurgist, crouched by the landing gear, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. "And this," he said, "a retractable nose wheel. We use tail draggers. Their design allows takeoff at lower angles, faster acceleration." "Or maybe," Ferrero said, "it's because they think ahead to paved runways and higher weights. This plane isn't meant for a short war." Vogel exhaled sharply. "Too heavy, too complicated. Look at it, it's industrial madness." Ferrero turned from the nacelle and gestured to the men. "No, Hauptmann. It's industrial confidence." They began removing panels methodically, documenting everything. The aluminum alloy felt tougher than the standard duralumin used in Italian fighters. The rivets were flush, perfectly machined. Inside the booms, they found insulated electrical cables, braided copper, thick and uniform, resistant to heat and vibration. Corsi lifted a bundle of the wiring. 24 volts, he said. "Our systems run at 12. Ferrero nodded slowly. "Twice the power. Half the voltage loss. More stable avionics, heavier weapons, stronger hydraulics. They build not for limits, but for expansion." At the far end of the hangar, Vogel unfolded a map of Italian aircraft designs. Macchi C.205, Fiat G.55, Region Re 2005. "Elegant," he said, tapping the papers. "Fast, agile, refined. This thing," he pointed toward the P-38, "is a brute." Ferrero stepped closer to the Lightning's wing, resting his hand on the unbroken panel. "Brutes win wars," he said simply. They moved to the engines next. The two Allison V-1710s were detached from their mounts and placed side by side on wooden stands. Even without power, they seemed alive. The men gathered around as Ferrero ran his hand over one of the intercoolers, its polished surface catching the lamplight. "Note this shape," he said. "Every curve purposeful. No wasted metal, no excess weight. The airflow moves through in perfect sequence. Compressor, intercooler, turbocharger, exhaust." Rinaldi, the youngest, leaned in closer. "Like a living system," he said softly. Ferrero nodded. "Yes, like anatomy. Like lungs." Vogel scoffed. "Romantic nonsense. A machine is a machine." Ferrero's gaze didn't waver. "Then tell me, Hauptmann, when was the last time a machine breathed?" Silence followed. Only the faint drip of oil broke it. He turned back to the engines, tracing a finger over the embossed plate on the casing. "Allison Division, General Motors, Indianapolis, USA." The letters were deep, flawless, and proud. He imagined hundreds, perhaps thousands, of these engines lined up in vast American factories, each identical, each perfect. To the men in that hangar, it looked less like a plane and more like something from another world. A machine built not just to fly but to prove a nation's power. Ferrero looked around the silent room, the faces lit by the reflection of polished steel. "We've built beauty," he said. "They've built eternity." The men said nothing. The hum of the lamps filled the air as the reality settled in. This was not a trophy. This was a warning. They thought they were studying a fighter. They were studying the future. The hangar smelled of oil, graphite, and exhaustion. Overhead, a single row of lamps cast a steady white glow, their light falling on a group of men in white coats. These were not soldiers. They were the Regia Aeronautica's experimental engineers, the quiet minds who spent the war dissecting wrecks, turning metal into mathematics. At the center stood Luigi Ferrero, directing the work. Around him moved a team drawn from Italy's best factories, Fiat Aviazione, Isata Fraschini, and Region. Each man wore gloves and carried calipers, not pistols. They spoke in low tones, Italian mingled with German as they recorded notes for Berlin's technical bureau. They started with the left engine. The Allison V-1710, still coated in soot and oil, was mounted on a wooden frame. With patient hands, they removed each cover plate and pipe, setting every piece on a cloth-lined table. Each part was numbered, weighed, and measured. Rinaldi, the youngest, pointed to the turbine wheel. "Even the smallest screw is stamped," he said. "Every washer identical. Like they were printed." Ferrero nodded. Stamped, balanced, serialized. No improvisation. He ran his fingers along the edge of a gear, so finely cut it caught the light like jewelry. Across the table, Bellotti, the metallurgist, studied a piston crown under magnification. The machining, perfect, he murmured. No tool marks, no hand finishing. They must grind them with diamond abrasives. He picked up another piston and weighed it in his palm. Every one the same within a gram. The men wrote their findings in 2 columns. German on one side, Italian on the other. The phrase that appeared again and again was stark and clinical. Precision machining beyond domestic capacity. As they continued, the silence deepened. The more they disassembled, the more impossible the picture became. The crankshaft, mirror smooth. The connecting rods, shot-peened for strength. The valves, chromed, polished, balanced to perfection. Each component seemed to whisper the same truth. This was not a handmade machine. It was the product of a nation that had mastered repetition. Ferrero wiped his brow and leaned closer to the open block. They don't build engines, he said softly. They reproduce them. Rinaldi looked up from his notes. Sir? Every part, Ferrero continued, is identical, modular. You could remove this turbine, replace it with another, and it would fit without adjustment. Try that with one of ours and you'd be filing for a week. Bellotti glanced at the others. Even our best factories can't do this, not under bombing. They have machine shops the size of towns. Ferrero didn't reply. He stared at the turbine blades, gleaming under the lamp's glow, the light bending along their perfect curves. He felt the weight of a truth no patriot wanted to admit. The war was not only being fought in the skies, it was being decided in the factories. When they paused for coffee, no one spoke. The sound of the percolator filled the hangar like distant static. The men's faces were tired, pale beneath the fluorescent glare. Ferrero walked to the table where the parts lay arranged in rows, gears, bearings, valves, pistons, rods. He rested his hand on the cool metal and whispered, "We thought we were craftsmen. But these men, these Americans, they are mathematicians." Corsi looked at him, puzzled. "What do you mean, sir?" Ferrero turned to him. "They've reduced perfection to numbers, to formulas, while we still build by instinct." He glanced back at the half-dismantled Allison, its innards shining like a sculpture of precision. "We can measure every dimension, but we'll never copy the idea that made it possible." The men returned to work in silence, the faint whir of calipers and scratching of pens the only sounds. One by one, they placed the components back on the table, each part a reflection of a civilization that built with science instead of style. Under the cold white lights, the realization settled over them like dust. They weren't just behind in technology. They were decades behind in the way they thought about machines. And for the first time, the men in white coats began to understand that their defeat was already written, in blueprints, not battles. They cleared a bench, laid fresh canvas, and set the left Allison V1710 on wooden blocks like a specimen. Even at rest it suggested motion. 12 cylinders in a tight V, coolant galleries like arteries, gear housings fared to reduce drag. The Italians had seen V12s before, Isata, Fraschini, Daimler-Benz, but not like this, not with every surface machined to the same quiet standard, not with a breathing system that turned waste into altitude. Ferrero touched a finger to the compressor scroll. The Allison wasn't only powerful, he said, voice low so it didn't break the hush, it was intelligent. They loosened the clamps along the boom side duct and lifted the elbowed pipework that carried exhaust rearward. The turbo supercharger revealed itself in 2 halves, a hot turbine driven by exhaust, and a cold compressor pushing dense air forward into the intake. Heat that should have been thrown away had been recruited, domesticated, made to work again. With a pencil, Ferrero traced the loop. Exhaust turbine overboard, while the turbine's shaft spun the centrifugal compressor whose outlet led through an intercooler before re-entering the V1710 supercharger and manifold. "Ricicla il proprio respiro," murmured Rinaldi. "It recycles its own breath." They set the turbine on a cradle. Bellotti steadied the housing while Corsi spun the impeller with a gloved fingertip. It whirred like a watch spring, free and eerily smooth, counting silent seconds before coasting to stillness. Close up, the Italians could see why. Blades thin as a thumbnail, each perfectly matched, root fillets without casting pits, faces polished to minimize boundary losses. The alloy's color, faint straw at the edges, told a metallurgist's story of nickel-chromium heat-resistant steel cured to live at exhaust gas temperatures that would wilt their own hardware. "Impossible de construire ca," whispered Bellotti. "Impossible to build here." Ferrero had them bring the Mackie C.202 drawings, A clean, elegant airplane on paper, direct-drive mechanical supercharger, tight cooling system, light airframe, superb at low and mid-altitude. He laid those sheets beside the lightning system map they were drafting in real time. A braided diagram of ducts, intercoolers, wastegates, oil coolers, charge air probes, and control lines. Two philosophies met on the table. One prized grace and pilot feel. The other subordinated grace to oxygen management, to the thermodynamics of keeping sea-level power at bomber altitudes where Italian fighters suffocated. They opened the wastegate controller, a compact governor that bled exhaust around the turbine to prevent overspeed and to hold boost steady as density fell with height. Even the controller's spring seats and poppet faces were ground flat enough to shame a jeweler. With calipers, Ferrero noted seat width, shaft clearance, travel. They aren't guessing boost, he said. They are commanding it. Numbers followed. On a fresh page he wrote manifold pressures the Allison could sustain aloft with turbo assist. Figures an Italian engine could only flash briefly before detonation. He added charge air temperature drops across the intercooler core by estimating fin density and face area, then sketched how the wing root radiator tunnels scavenged heat without punishing drag. To a pilot it would feel like a throttle that didn't thin out with sky. Potenza? Asked Corsi, pencil hovering. Ferrero answered carefully, unwilling to claim more than the machine in front of him deserved. These early blocks are rated around 1,300 to 1,475 horsepower apiece in combat trim depending on fuel and cooling, more in emergency. Later J and L refinements, with fuel and cooling to match, approach 1,600 horsepower each. The architecture scales. He underlined the last two words. Architecture scales. He knew the number would travel down corridors and come back as a legend. 3,200 horsepower together. He wanted it recorded with an engineer's caution, not a propagandist's shout. They pulled the reduction gear cover. No spalls on the teeth, case hardening clean to depth, contact pattern wide and even. The mirror image gearing that let one prop turn clockwise and the other counterclockwise was achieved with a simple swap in the gear train, a single family of parts yielding two-handed outputs. The Italians admired the elegance. One engine family, two rotations, logistics simplified, torque effects tamed. Around the Allison's base, the ancillaries told the same story. Dual magnetos, twin plugs per cylinder, redundancy embodied. 24-volt electrics with stout wiring runs and proper strain relief. Armored hydraulic lines. Quick disconnects on fuel and oil with positive stops to prevent partial engagement. Nothing exotic in principle, only a relentless refusal to accept field variability. Make it the same everywhere forever. They split the intercooler core from its frame. Fin density was shocking. The soldered lattice looked like gauze made of metal. A clumsy hand could crush it. Yet in service, tucked inside a carefully fed duct, it would turn murderous heat into performance. On the bench nearby, the oil cooler showed the same obsession with surface area per kilogram. Italy could braze such cores, but not at this consistency, not at this pace, not with aluminum as pure as these stampings implied. Ferrero wrote another line, ink pressing hard, Ogni part vive in un sistema. Every part lives inside a system. He had spent a decade admiring perfect parts. The Lightning demanded a new admiration, for interfaces and flows, for how fuels, gases, heat, and loads moved together like a choreographed company. Perch du motori? Rinaldi asked, though he already sensed the answer. Ferrero ticked points on his palm. Range for oceanic war, survival on one engine, altitude climb when supercharged and turbo-fed, weapons and systems power without starving the airframe. And with both turning, he added, it chooses the fight. If it refuses, it leaves. He set the turbine back in its cradle. Silence returned, broken only by a distant generator and the tiny tick of cooling metal. The men stood over the Allison as if at bedside, listening for meaning inside the stillness. For the first time, Ferrero said, not looking up, we are beginning to understand that we haven't been fighting the same war at all. By the fourth day the Lightning no longer looked like an airplane. It was now a skeleton of cables and panels, each organ removed, labeled, and laid across trestle tables that stretched the length of the hangar. In the lamplight the pieces glowed faintly, silver, brass, copper, and steel, like relics from a civilization more advanced than their own. Outside, Naples shook every night under the distant growl of Allied bombers. Inside, the Italian engineers worked in silence, the ticking of calipers and the scratching of pencils the only sounds left in a country that was beginning to fall apart. They had built beautiful planes, machines that danced through the air, agile, elegant, hand-shaped with pride. The Macchi C.205, the Fiat G.55, the Region 2005. Each was a triumph of artistry over industry. Their lines were graceful, their handling precise, their finish meticulous. They were crafted by men who treated flight as sculpture. But now, staring at the P-38's disassembled core, the beauty of handcraft looked suddenly fragile. The Americans had not built art. They had built factories that made airplanes faster than Italy could make dreams. Ferrero stood near the workbench where the turbocharger rested, its impeller gleaming under the white light. He didn't speak. His cigarette burned slowly between his fingers, the smoke curling upward like a thin ghost above the machine. Around him, his men gathered in a quiet circle, notebooks closed as if words no longer helped. They all knew the truth now. No matter how many measurements they took, how carefully they traced the ducts and gears, there was nothing they could reproduce here, not in bombed-out workshops, not with shortages of steel, not with their factories running on candlelight and faith. Bellotti broke the silence first. If we had their resources, their machines, we could match this. Ferrero didn't look up. But we don't, he said. And they know it. He stubbed out the cigarette on the edge of the bench, the ember dying beside the turbine housing. The faint metallic click echoed in the still air. Corsi lifted the impeller wheel carefully, holding it against the light. The blade edges caught the glow like mirrors. It's just metal, he said quietly. Ferrero shook his head. No. It's the sound of a nation running out of time. Outside, the distant thunder of bombers returned, rolling over the hills from the coast. The men froze for a moment, instinctively glancing at the roof. The vibrations trembled through the concrete floor, rattling the hanging tools. Ferrero closed his notebook, folded his arms, and looked down at the tables of parts. The immaculate symmetry, the perfection of fit, the serial numbers that meant an identical twin existed somewhere across the ocean. He imagined the assembly lines at Burbank, rows of women in kerchiefs riveting wings, men in coveralls aligning engines, conveyor belts feeding endless streams of aircraft parts into waiting hands. Machines birthing machines, an empire of production that no bomb could silence. Then he thought of Turin, of his own small workshop where workers filed parts by hand and measured tolerance by sight. Of the power cuts, the air raid sirens, the factory roofs torn open by explosions. He felt pride, then shame, then something colder than either, resignation. Their craftsmanship was exquisite, but it was slow, human, and doomed in a world that now belonged to machines. Ferrero looked at the turbine one last time. Its surface still shimmered under the lamp, flawless, eternal. He turned away, his voice barely above a whisper. They haven't just built a better engine. They've built a new kind of civilization. And for the first time since the war began, the engineers of Italy understood that their defeat wasn't waiting on the battlefield. It was already humming quietly on a workbench in Naples. By the end of the week, the hangar was quiet. The tools had been cleaned and stored, the tables cleared of drawings, the engines covered once more in canvas. What remained was paper, the kind of report no one wanted to write. Ferrero sat alone at a long wooden desk, sleeves rolled up, a cup of cold coffee beside him. The air smelled of ink and fatigue. Around him, the others worked in silence, gathering notes and sketches into neat stacks. Outside, the wind carried the distant hum of bombers over the bay, a sound so familiar now it barely drew their eyes to the ceiling. He began with the facts. Every line careful, neutral, professional. Subject: examination of captured American fighter Lockheed P-38 Lightning. Engines: 2 Allison V1710 liquid-cooled V12, each equipped with turbo supercharger. Performance: estimated total output 2,850 to 3,200 horsepower. Assessment: advanced metallurgy, non-replicable under current conditions. He paused. The phrase looked sterile on the page, a technical phrase for something far heavier. He continued, turbocharger design of exceptional sophistication. Materials and tolerances exceed present Italian or German capacity. Operational philosophy emphasizes modularity, rapid replacement, and redundancy. Not conceptually superior, industrially superior. He underlined that last sentence twice before moving on. At the opposite desk, Bellotti was writing the metallurgical appendix, page after page describing alloys they couldn't produce, treatments they couldn't achieve, furnaces they didn't have. He read aloud softly, half to himself, nickel-chrome turbine alloy stable at 700 degrees C. Precision casting via lost wax process. American production tolerances measured in thousands. Ferrero nodded without lifting his eyes. Include it, he said. Berlin should see what precision costs when a nation can afford it. Rinaldi, typing from dictation, hesitated at the next section. Do we mention Germany's request for test data? Yes, Ferrero said, but not the conclusions. They won't like them. He dictated slowly. Further cooperation with German technical offices recommended only if practical turbocharger samples can be secured from Reich factories. Current German focus on mechanical supercharging limits comparative progress. The sentence was cautious, polite, but it carried an unspoken truth. Even the Germans were behind. Hours passed. The engineers worked until dusk turned to night, and still the report grew. When it was done, the stack of pages was thick. Technical drawings, airflow calculations, alloy composition charts, engine disassembly notes, and at the end, a short section Ferrero had written by hand. Strategic summary. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning demonstrates an industrial order of magnitude beyond Italian manufacturing capacity. It represents not a difference in design philosophy but a difference in civilization scale. Victory in modern warfare will belong not to the nation that builds the best ideas, but to the one that can build them faster than they can be destroyed. He signed it, Luigi Ferrero, Technical Division, Regia Aeronautica Experimental Unit, Capodichino. He placed the bundle into a courier envelope, sealed it, and handed it to Rinaldi. Take it to the Naples rail post, he said. It leaves for Rome at dawn. Rinaldi saluted faintly, tucked the envelope inside his coat, and disappeared into the night. But the report never reached Rome. That night, the city's rail depot was hit by an Allied bombing raid. The blast wave leveled the central sorting hall. Trains burned for hours and crates of military correspondence caught fire one by one, the air thick with smoke and paper ash. Among the cinders that drifted over the rooftops were fragments of the engineers' work, half-melted pages, lines of words still legible for an instant before they curled and vanished. Advanced metallurgy, non-replicable under current conditions. American advantage industrial, not conceptual. Then the wind carried them away, scattering their truth across the darkened city. Some truths are too heavy to survive the war that created them. 2 weeks passed. The wrecked Lightning was gone now, scrapped, its remains carted off under orders from Rome, but the memory of its perfection lingered in every man who had touched it. The hangar at Capodichino felt emptier, as if something greater than metal had been taken away. Then one morning the sound returned. It began as a low hum over the sea, just a faint vibration on the edge of hearing. The men working in the hangar paused, tools halfway to the bench. They knew that sound, 2 engines perfectly harmonized, the deep rhythm of twin propellers cutting the air in alternating waves. Ferrero stepped outside into the white heat of noon. The sky above Naples shimmered with sunlight and smoke trails. Then he saw them. A formation of P-38 Lightnings swept in from the west, sunlight flashing off their wings like mirrors. Dozens of them, flying in perfect pairs, the same silhouette he had studied for days. The twin booms, the tricycle gear, the twin hearts of the Allison engines now roaring at full power. The ground crews froze. The air raid siren began to wail too late. Dio mio, whispered Rinaldi. It's them. The first bombs fell on the harbor. A wall of smoke and dust climbed into the sky, black against the blue. The concussion rolled through the airfield, shaking windows and knocking dust from the rafters. The engineers ducked behind the hangar wall as the second wave came in. The sound was deafening, a chorus of turbines, synchronized thunder echoing from horizon to horizon. The men who had once handled the Lightning's silent remains now felt its fury alive again, multiplied and merciless. Ferrero crouched near the entrance, hands over his ears, eyes fixed upward. Through the haze he could make out their shapes banking sharply, diving in pairs, releasing bombs in clean, disciplined rhythm. He recognized every detail, the engine placement, the propeller pattern, the way the wings flexed under power. Each one a mirror of the machine they had studied in awe only weeks before. Each one a ghost of their own discovery, returned to destroy what little they still possessed. Corsi shouted over the noise, "They're hitting the fuel depots." Flames erupted across the edge of the airfield. The heat washed over them like a furnace blast. Sheets of corrugated metal peeled from the hangar roofs and spun away into the wind. Ferrero stayed low, his heart pounding with something that was not fear but recognition. "They've come back for their own," he murmured. Rinaldi turned to him, face streaked with soot. "For their own." Ferrero nodded slowly. "The one we took apart. This is its family." The engines howled above them, one long mechanical roar fading toward the horizon. When the last plane disappeared into the sun, the silence left behind felt heavier than the noise. The air stank of burned oil and smoke. The engineers emerged one by one, brushing ash from their coats. The hangar roof was torn open, daylight pouring in where the panels had collapsed. A column of smoke rose from the far end of the runway, where the supply sheds had been. Ferrero stood in the doorway, staring at the sky still rippling from heat and exhaust. His eyes followed the faint contrail stretching north toward the sea. He spoke quietly, almost reverently, "We touched the heart of their machine. Now it has returned, multiplied, faster, untouchable." No one replied. The others simply watched the drifting clouds and burning horizon, knowing that what they had studied in curiosity now ruled the air above them. Behind them, the wreckage of their own aircraft glinted faintly in the sunlight. Italian, elegant, handmade, and suddenly ancient. The age of artistry had ended. The age of industry had come screaming down from the sky. Italy, 1948. The war was over, the kingdom gone, and the hangar at Capodichino stood in sunlight again. Its roof repaired, its walls repainted, its silence replaced by the whir of lathes and the smell of fresh metal. Where once men had dissected a symbol of defeat, new engineers now assembled the future. Many of them were the same faces, older, thinner, quieter. Former officers of the Regia Aeronautica, technicians from Fiat Aviazione, apprentices who had once taken notes by candlelight while bombs fell outside. Now they wore clean blue overalls marked with the new name, Air Italia. The world had changed. Italy's aircraft industry, shattered by war and surrender, was being reborn under new contracts, this time for peace, civilian transport, training aircraft, and soon the jet age. The same hangar where the P-38 Lightning had been taken apart in fear now echoed with the sounds of creation. Hammers striking rivets, engines being tested on stands, and the hum of power returning to a country that had once lost it. On one wall hung a framed photograph, a black and white image of the disassembled American fighter taken in 1943. Beneath it, a single caption in neat handwriting read, "The machine that taught us humility." Luigi Ferrero, now gray at the temples, walked the floor with a clipboard, stopping to inspect the cooling ducts of a prototype fuselage. He still carried the same small notebook from the war, its pages yellowed and filled with sketches of turbine blades, intercooler diagrams, and wiring layouts copied from the Lightning. At one corner of the hangar, young technicians gathered around an old workbench. On it lay several pieces of the original P-38 they had preserved, a section of the turbo casing, a gear segment, and a small bundle of braided copper wiring. The metal was dull now, its polish long gone, but to these men it was sacred. One of the younger engineers turned the turbine fragment over in his hands and said, "This was once the enemy's heart." Ferrero smiled faintly. "No," he said. "It was our teacher." From across the floor, Johnny Caproni, the veteran aircraft designer who had survived the war and returned to guide Italy's recovery, watched the exchange. He had written once in his post-war notes, "We learned more from that wreck than from all our textbooks. It showed us not only what to build but how to think." That sentiment now guided every project in the hangar. The new aircraft being designed borrowed lessons from the P-38's forgotten parts. Pressurized fuel injection for reliability, turbine cooling ducts inspired by the Allison's airflow logic, redundant electrical circuits copied from the Lightning's dual generator system. Even the training manuals reminded students that efficiency is beauty. As Ferrero walked the floor, he passed a line of newly built jet trainers gleaming under the morning light. Their shapes were modern, swept wings, tricycle gear, compact engines, yet something in their design carried an echo of the twin-boom marvel that had once humbled them. He stopped beside one of the apprentices sketching wiring routes and said softly, "Make sure every wire has a purpose. The Americans taught us that no detail is too small to build a civilization." The young man nodded, unaware that he was repeating a promise made 5 years earlier in the shadow of war. Outside, the sun climbed higher over Naples. Planes taxied across the rebuilt runway, their jet engines whining softly where propellers once roared. Inside, Ferrero turned one last look toward the old photograph on the wall, the gleaming wreck of 1943, and smiled. Defeat had become lesson. Lesson had become progress. The Lightning was gone, but its spark had survived in the minds of those who once feared it. What had begun as a study of surrender had become the blueprint of rebirth. By the early 1950s, Italy had changed its uniform, its allies, and its destiny. What had once been the Regia Aeronautica was now part of NATO, and Italian pilots trained side by side with the same airmen who had once bombed their cities. The irony was quiet, almost dignified. Men who had studied the wreckage of American aircraft now flew American-built jets with the same twin-seat discipline and checklist precision they had once envied. At Amendola Air Base, sunlight gleamed across lines of shiny silver F-84 Thunderjets, their wings sharp and their cockpits pressurized, the next evolution of everything that began with the Lightning. On the tarmac, instructors from the United States Air Force demonstrated fuel management systems, high-altitude oxygen controls, and turbine procedures. The Italian officers listened carefully, notebooks open, their faces thoughtful. Ferrero, now older, stood among them as an observer. He no longer wore a uniform. He was a consultant for Air Italia's research division, advising on jet turbine metallurgy and airflow efficiency. The sound of a jet engine spooling up outside the hangar brought a small, involuntary smile to his face. It was the same feeling he'd had years ago when the Lightning's turbo impeller had first spun freely under his fingers, a sense of awe at the invisible forces men could now command. On his desk lay 2 photographs, one of the P-38 wreck in Sicily, the other of a sleek Air Italia prototype taxiing under the morning sun. Between them stretched only a decade, but also a lifetime of progress, humility, and understanding. Narration filled the moment. The P-38 that crashed in Sicily didn't just fight a battle. It started a quiet revolution in how the world built machines. From its ruins came engineers who measured more carefully, planned more completely, and learned that power was no longer the gift of genius. It was the result of precision. Bellotti, the metallurgist, once wrote in his later papers for the Polytechnic of Turin, "We stopped building beauty for its own sake. We began building endurance and found beauty inside it." That was the legacy of the Lightning, not just a fighter but a teacher. It had shown Italy, and the rest of the world, that victory in the modern age belonged not to those who dreamed fastest, but to those who built with discipline. In the final years of his career, Ferrero often lectured young engineers about that lesson. He would begin not with theories of thrust or drag, but with a simple story of the day they took apart an American fighter that shouldn't have existed, and discovered that the future had already landed years ahead of them. He would end the same way every time, his voice quiet but certain. "Sometimes," he said, "the future lands behind enemy lines first." The words always drew silence, not applause, the silence of understanding. Outside the classroom windows, the sky was alive with jet trails, thin white lines cutting across the blue, the same sky that once echoed with the roar of twin Allisons, the same horizon where defeat had turned into progress. And somewhere in that endless sound of engines, if you listened closely enough, you could still hear it. The heartbeat of the Lightning, the machine that taught its enemies how to build tomorrow. In that hangar in Naples, amid the smoke and the silence, a handful of engineers once stood over an American engine that shouldn't have existed, not in their world, not with their tools, not with their factories still scarred by bombs. The Allison V1710 idled no more, yet even lifeless it radiated something extraordinary: precision, balance, foresight. It was a machine that spoke a language no one there had ever learned, one written in metallurgy, mathematics, and mass production. They didn't curse it. They admired it. Because for all their pride, their artistry, and their courage, they understood what they were looking at. It wasn't just an aircraft. It was a mirror. A mirror reflecting what the next century would belong to, not the craftsman's touch, but the factory's rhythm. Not the romantic dream of flight, but the cold, perfect harmony of engineering and industry. Outside, the war thundered on. Inside, those men had already glimpsed its ending. Defeat, they realized, doesn't always come with gunfire or surrender. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the turning of a turbine, in the hum of a generator, in the impossible smoothness of a gear. And in that moment, standing before the P-38 Lightning, they saw the truth. Defeat isn't just measured in battles lost, but in the instant your enemy shows you what tomorrow looks like. This is Shadows of Valor, where invention meets courage and where every untold story finds its voice. Subscribe and join us for the next hidden chapter of history.